Hello, I'm Howie. I will talking about all the questions below. The first question is, what is a tariff? What is a reciprocal tariff? Let's begin with the basics. A tariff is simply a tax on imports. For example, if Taiwan exports electronic goods to the US and the US imposes a 10% tariff, the cost of these goods rises by 10% in the US dollars. Now, a reciprocal tariff means Taiwan also imposes a similar or equal tariffs in response, in this case, on imports from the United States. This is intended to maintain fairness or leverage in trade negotiations. The second question is, how will this reciprocal tariff directly affect Taiwan's exports to the United States? How will it directly affect Taiwan's imports from the United States? The reciprocal tariffs affect both directions of trade. Taiwan's goods become more expensive in the US, reducing demand. Likewise, US goods become more expensive in Taiwan, decreasing imports. Overall, this policy dampens trade between two nations. And then we see the question 3. What is the nominal exchange rate? How will it be affected by the reciprocal tariff? First, the definition of the nominal exchange rate is the rate at which one currency can be exchanged for another in the foreign exchange market. And then we see the diagram. In the diagram, you can see that the vertical axis is nominal exchange rate. The horizontal axis is quantity of US dollars. The downward sloping is the demand curve, represent Taiwan's demand for US dollars to import goods from the US. The upward sloping is the supply curve, represents supply of US dollars from exports to the US. Before the tariffs, the market is at equilibrium, but after Taiwan imposes a reciprocal tariff on US goods, there's less demand for imports at US. As a result, Taiwan's firms need fewer US dollars to pay for imports. This causes the demand for US to shift left, shown by the new demand curve, D plot. The new intersection of supply and demand shows a lower nominal exchange rate. Meaning the new Taiwanese dollars has appreciated relative to the US dollars. In short, the reciprocal tariff reduces trade volume and leads to an appreciation of the local currency. The question 4 is, based on your graphical analysis, will the new Taiwanese dollars appreciate or depreciate as a result of the reciprocal tariffs? As a direct result of the reciprocal tariff, the new Taiwanese dollars appreciates. This is because Taiwan imports less from the US, reducing the need for US dollars and hence lowering its demand. The fifth question is, how will the reciprocal tariff directly affect the United States net exports? The US exports less due to Taiwanese reciprocal tariff, but it also imports less from Taiwan. If the reduction in imports is larger than the reduction in exports, then the trade balance improves, meaning US net exports increasing slightly. And we see the question 6. What is the real exchange rate? How will it be affected by the reciprocal tariffs? The real exchange rate adjusts the nominal exchange rate by relative prices between the two countries. It is calculated as the nominal exchange rate times domestic price level divided by foreign price level. And then we can see the diagram. The vertical axis is the real exchange rate. The horizontal axis is the quantity of the US dollars exchanged into foreign currency. And we use the demand curve and the supply curve. In the US market, we see a decrease in the demand for NT dollars. This leads to the decline in the real exchange rate. Making US goods cheaper abroad. On the graph, label the vertical axis as the real exchange rate and the horizontal axis as the quantity of US dollars exchanged. And then the question 7 is, based on your graphical analysis, will the reciprocal tariff actually improve the United States net exports as Trump expects? Based on our diagram, the reciprocal tariffs lead to lower imports into the US and potentially higher exports due to favorable exchange rates. Thus, Trump's expectations about improving the trade balance might be correct in the short term. However, this also depends on long-term consumer behavior and the global market reaction. And then we see the part 2. The question 1 is, how will the increase in Taiwan's semiconductor exports affect Taiwan's real GDP and price level in the short run? In the short run, an increase in semiconductor exports raises the aggregate demand because the net exports increase, and it will cause the aggregate demand increase, and then the real GDP increase. From the graph, we can see that the aggregate demand curve, it will shift to right. And then the real GDP will from Y1 to Y2, and the price level will increase by P1 to P2. And the second question is, what type of investment is the construction of R&D centers? How does this affect GDP and price level? The construction of R&D centers is physical capital investment. This boosts aggregate demand and productive capacity. We can see that the eddy curve will shift to right. Question 3. What type of investment is the purchase of TSMC shares by foreign investors? What are its short-run effects? When foreign investors buy shares of TSMC, that's a portfolio investment, not a real economy activity counted in GDP. It enters the financial account, not the current account. In the short run, it doesn't boost aggregate demand. However, it does increase demand for NT dollars, potentially appreciating Taiwan's currency and reducing net exports slightly. So the direct effect on GDP is neutral to slightly negative. The question 4. If Taiwan takes no action, what will happen to GDP and prices in the long run? In the long run, the economy adjusts, the wages and input price rise. The short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left, and the output returns to potential GDP, and the price level remains high, but the GDP returns to full employment level. The question 5. If Taiwan wants to cool down the economy, what policy tools can be used? If Taiwan is worried about overheating, rising prices, asset bubbles, it can use 2 types of contractionary policies. The first one is that the central bank raises the interest rate. that discourages borrowing and slows investment. The second is that the government can reduce spending or increasing taxes. Both methods shift the aggregate demand curve leftward, stabilizing prices and reducing the risk of inflation. And then we see part 3. The question 1 is that how will this budget cut directly influence aggregate demand in Taiwan? How will changes in aggregate demand affect real GDP and the overall price level in Taiwan in the short run? Budget cuts represent a decrease in government spending. A key component of aggregate demand is aggregate demand equals to component plus investment plus government spending plus net export. In the short run, it will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left, indicating a fall in total spending in the economy. As a result, both real GDP and the overall price level will decrease, causing a contractionary effect on Taiwan's economy. The second question is, do you expect a multiplier effect to result from the decrease in government spending? My answer is yes. A multiplier effect is expected. The multiplier quantifies how an initial change in spending leads to further changes in income and consumption. When the government reduces spending, the recipients of that spending reduce their own consumption due to lower income, which further reduce the overall demand. The formula is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. The third question is, how will this budget cost directly affect public saving? What will be the effects on demand and supply in Taiwan's loanable funds market? How will the real interest rates, private investment, private saving, and the national saving be affected? Government budget cuts typically increase public saving, less deficit, more surplus. This increases the supply of loanable funds, shifting the supply curve rightward. This results in a lower real interest rates, encourage private investment. However, the fall in overall economy activity may reduce private saving, partially offsetting national saving gains. It will shift the supply curve S1 to S2, and it will be the lower real interest rates and the more funds available. The fourth question is that, based on your analysis in question 3, what will happen to Taiwan's net capital outflow? With lower interest rates from question 3, returns on Taiwanese assets fall, making them less attractive to foreign investors. Taiwanese investors seek higher returns abroad, increasing net capital outflow. A decrease in real interest rates leads to a movement along the NCO curves to the right, so it will increase the net capital outflow. The fifth question is, how will the change in net capital outflow affect the supply of new Taiwanese dollars in the foreign currency exchange market? An increase in net capital outflow raises the supply of new Taiwanese dollars in the foreign exchange market, as Taiwanese investors convert NT dollars into foreign currency. This depreciates the NT dollars, making Taiwanese goods cheaper abroad, and net exports rises. The graphical analysis, we can see that in the real exchange rate, it will become lower. It represents the depreciation of the currency. The last question is, based on your previous analysis in question 3 and 5, How will these budget costs indirectly influence Taiwan's aggregate demand? By summarizing the direct impact of reduced government spending, the multiplier effects, and the indirect effects via the loanable funds and the foreign exchange market, do you expect the aggregate demand in Taiwan to increase or decrease as a result of the legislative yuan's budget cuts? Indirectly, the budget cuts, the first is reduce the aggregate demand, and trigger a negative multiplier from question 2, increase public saving, and the lower interest rates from question 3. And the question 4 say it will increase the net capital outflow, and the NT dollars will depreciate, and the net exports rises from question 4 and question 5. These offsetting effects may lead to initial decrease in aggregate demand due to direct spending cuts, partial recovery in aggregate demand due to export-led growth and investment. Conclusion is that the net impact on aggregate demand depends on the size of the multiplier and elasticity of trade. If multiplier effects are strong and export gains are modest, aggregate demand is likely to decrease overall. That's all. Thank you for your listening.